and Dr. Ganesh Natarajan, who will be in conversation with her. Today's, let me say that as part of our seminar series, today's discussion or seminar is a slightly different kind. We actually have a conversation between Dr. Ganesh and Anita, and then we will have a open Q&A with all of you. I will, of course, those of you who are coming for the first time, please make sure that you sign your name, because we have a mailing list and we have these seminars or discussions or roundtables or conversations every week, sometimes more than once a week. So please sign up, and they're open to all. And also today is a little busy day, so there's also an event for those of you who don't mind staying back in the Kali Auditorium. There's a public talk by Professor Suraj Yagde from Harvard University at 6 o'clock. So once again, thank you for all coming here, and I will request actually the formal introduction. And I must say that we are delighted that Anita Bhatia is here, because she has worn many hats. Currently she's with the United Nations, but formerly with the World Bank and the IFC, the International Finance Corporation. And she told me that she's by training a lawyer, a historian, a political scientist, and I think they say because World Bank, so by definition an economist. So warm welcome to Local Institute, and request Ganesh. By the way, Dr. Ganesh Natarajan, also an old friend, is being the president of NASSCOM, the apex body for software and IT services. He's been a very successful IT entrepreneur and currently runs many non-profit ventures, including the Lighthouse Foundation, which reminds me, I think the CEO of Lighthouse is here. So over to you, Ganesh, the formal introduction.
Thank you, Dr. Rande. I'm so used to calling you Majid that it sounds difficult to call you Dr. Rande, but we should. So we are excited to be here, because just as a quick background to my own interactions with Anita, I joined the advisory board of an entity called UN Women in India just about 8 months back. And about 3 months ago, we were delighted when Anita came down from New York and chatted with the entire advisory board, talked about big scaling ideas for gender equity, which obviously UN Women cannot be not about gender equity and gender opportunity in the world. And since then, we've kind of become good friends, and she invited me to do a counter fireside chat, where she was chatting with me and I was doing most of the talking in the Kautilya Institute of Public Policy, where she's also an advisor. And today, of course, she wears a lot of hats, and I won't steal her thunder. Let me give you a formal introduction so that we can get started. Anita is Assistant Secretary General for Resource Management, Sustainability, Partnerships, and the Deputy Executive Director of the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, short form UN Women. Ms. Bhatia has had a distinguished career in the World Bank Group, which Dr. Rande alluded to, serving in various senior leadership and management positions, both at the World Bank headquarters and in the field. She was telling me this amazing story about escaping from Bolivia, which I will ask her to share, because the joys of being in the World Bank are also kind of, it comes with the baggage of being in dangerous countries at various points of time. She brings extensive experience in the area of strategic partnerships, resource mobilization and management, which is her main role today. She served for several years as Director of Global Partnerships for the IFC, International Finance Corporation, the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. Also developed and expanded innovative partnerships with public and private sector partners to support the IFC strategy in key areas including fragile and conflict-affected states, gender equality, financial inclusion, support to women-owned businesses, and other priorities critical for the achievement of the UN SDGs or the Sustainable Development Goals, which all of us are familiar with. In addition, Anita has served as Director for Development Partner Relationships in the World Bank, in which she led the efforts to ensure strategic alignment between institutional priorities and resource mobilization across the World Bank. In various positions, Anita focused on enhancing sustainability, institutional effectiveness and impact. As head of IFC's Latin America advisory operations, based in Lima and La Paz, as you know, Peru and Bolivia, she successfully grew the corporation's reach and impact in this region. As Director of Partnerships and Advisory Operations, she has also overseen financial management, risk management, portfolio management, has led diverse teams, including as Global Head of Knowledge Management, Head of Business Process Improvement, and Change Management, And in addition to Latin America, Anita has worked in Africa, Europe, Central Asia, South and East Asia. Most important, Ms. Bhatia, like many of us, originally our roots are in Calcutta. So she holds a BA in history from Calcutta University, and MA in political science from Yale University, and is a Juris Doctor in law from Georgetown University. So with that very elaborate introduction, let me start by asking Anita, tell us your story. Loreto, Calcutta, the first time topper in Calcutta University in history. What happened?
First, let me just say what a pleasure it is for me to be here with all of you, and thank you very much to Dr. Anande, to you Ganesh for the invitation. A little bit about my story, if you insist. So yes, I did grow up and study in Calcutta, and I did choose to go to Loreto, which was not an easy decision because I was really torn between going to Loreto and Presidency, which was where all the brains in my school ended up going. But I decided I wanted the downtown life, and so I went to Loreto. But the big challenge was Loreto was a school that hadn't seen a first-class first in history for many, many decades. And so I had set myself this goal that I was going to get that first-class first, and I was very happy when I did. I ended up going to graduate school in the US, where I ended up changing what I had started out to do. I started out doing a PhD in political science, but then had a delightful mentor called T.N. Srinivasan, who was the director of the Center of Economic Growth at Yale. And he persuaded me that it was okay to say I'm not going to do the PhD and I'm actually going to switch to development. But I still wanted to study more, so I decided to get a law degree. And then I joined the World Bank, working on a research project with TN and Jagdish Bhalpati, who was working on the World Development Report at that time, and never left. And I'm so grateful as I look back today on my career at the World Bank Group, because it gave me exposure not just to Africa, to the issues in Africa, and I would really date myself by telling you that when I started in Africa, one of the big debates in development those days was what was the role of the state in development and whether it was okay or not to privatize. And I will never forget my first mission, which was to Tanzania to discuss with the government how it should privatize several state-owned assets, including a beer company. And we had these very ideological discussions about how the state was much better placed to run a beer company than the private sector. So that tells you how long I've been working in development, because of course the role of the private sector in development is much better understood, and the smaller role of the state is also much better understood today. And so I worked at the World Bank. I worked on transition economies, in all the starts when they were first formed, Georgia, Armenia, all of those countries. Worked in Europe, worked in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and then had the opportunity to go overseas. So spent many, many years in Latin America working on advisory services for the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector part of the bank, and something that is not very well known and might be interesting to people who are interested in development is that the balance sheet of IFC is actually now bigger than the operations of other parts of the bank, because IFC last year committed almost $26 billion, and of course IDA is about $75 billion, but IBRD is actually now smaller than IFC, but this is not very well known. And so IFC was, really epitomizes the working of the private sector for development. And as the largest investor in emerging markets, you get a really fantastic picture of what are the constraints to development from a private sector lens. And then I was approached by a woman who had been the deputy to Nelson Mandela just after apartheid, when Nelson Mandela became president of South Africa. She was running this entity which I had never heard of, called UN Women. And the reason I hadn't heard of it is it's a very new entity. It's only been in the UN and in the global multilateral system for 12 years. And it was founded by Ban Ki-moon when he was the Secretary General of the UN. And he told me he founded it because he got to the UN, he looked around and he said, there's an agency for everything here, for trade, for human rights, for children, for agriculture, for food delivery, but there's nothing working on this big, wicked problem of gender inequality, and so he decided to set this up. So Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka, who was Mandela's right-hand person, whom I knew through a common friend, came to me and said, would you consider, working at the UN Women? So she was very persuasive, and I left the World Bank and I joined UN Women, and here I am. And I have to say, these few years at the UN, working on this very complex issue, which when I worked at the World Bank Group, I thought I understood. The last few years have really shown me how little I really knew about the problem. So it has been a fantastic learning experience. And, the juncture that we sit at today, when you look at just how much reversal of progress there is on gender inequality, well, that's what we're doing.
Absolutely. In fact, you're talking about reversal of progress. You would know that COVID has been particularly bad for women in India and probably in various parts of the world. I'm also on the board of an entity called Educate Girls, which works with tribal women or tribal girls, out of school girls, putting them back in school in tribal areas of Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, UP, and shortly Bihar. And I don't know if you know that most children obviously dropped out of school during COVID, but 70% of the women in some of the tribal areas in India have never gone back out. Because they are now so actively engaged in agriculture as cheap labor for the farmer father, or for that matter in household work, that families are reluctant to send them back to school. So we have some real issues there. And we will talk about that. But before that, I do want to talk about the joys and the dangers of working in the World Bank. So tell us a little about that Bolivia experience in this program. It's a very interesting story.
Well, the Bolivia experience is I had set up a head office for advisory operations for Latin America in La Paz, Bolivia. Bolivia had a president called Boni Sanchez Lozada. And the population of Bolivia, the indigenous people, felt that inequality was too high and they wanted a change of regime. And so they took to the streets and they decided that they would attack all the representatives of foreign institutions, which of course included the World Bank. My husband was the head of the World Bank there, I was the head of IFC, so we were particularly vulnerable. And we lived in a part of the city where the former president of Bolivia lived. So we knew that we, might be attacked. My husband was in Paris, I was at home with 2 young kids, and, the domestic staff who supported us. And we were scared for our lives because people were banging doors, they were attacking, people were being killed. And I had this good idea the day before all the protests started. We had a little guardhouse in front of our house, and I'd said, let's put this inside so that nobody knows there's somebody here who needs a guard. So thank God we had done that. But it was clear that we were going to be attacked at some point. So we decided that we would have to disguise ourselves, myself and the kids, and escape. And because my husband's American, my son looks very white, my daughter looks very Indian, but we knew that if we walked out in the streets, people would know we were foreigners. Already people had attacked, knocked on the door and said, who lives here? Are they foreigners? Are they Bolivians? And our domestic helpers said, no, they're Bolivians, right? So what happened was a number of people were killed downtown, and it became clear that the only way you could escape was if you had a flag on your roof which showed that you were Bolivian. You had to put up a Bolivian flag as a sign of solidarity for Bolivians. Well, we didn't have a Bolivian flag except for a little one that we used to take to soccer matches. And so we had to think, how are we going to make a flag? And we had somebody who worked with us who said, I will make a flag. I will take your shopping bag from Amsterdam airport, which is yellow. I will remove with kerosene or something, the letters on it. I will attach it to some green paper and some other paper. And in the middle of the night, we will creep up to the roof and put it at the back of the roof so that from a distance you will see the flag. The people won't know it's made of plastic. So that's what we did. And then I had to disguise myself, wear sweats, roll them in the dirt in the garden to look really, so that they look dirty, cover up the kids' heads with sweatshirts. Now Bolivian protesters are very fierce protesters, but they always stop for lunch. And so, because you live at altitude and you don't eat dinner, the only meal you really have in the day is lunch. So the lunch is sacrosanct. So talking to my domestic staff, they said, and if you want to escape, it's got to be during lunch. So at lunchtime, we pretended we were going out for a walk. And we walked for a long time to the house of the American ambassador where we took refuge. We stayed there for 10 days. It became clear that the regime was unsustainable. The Americans were supporting Boni. finally they had to fly him out of the country in the middle of the night, and then some semblance of normalcy returned. So, but we had death threats, and it was very scary, and we were being monitored from Washington. The people were saying, escape, escape, and I was saying there's no way to escape because there are fires outside the house. They have made holes in the ground so you cannot drive the car. There are potholes the size of half this room. So how am I going to drive the car? I can't get out. So we were terrified for our lives, but we escaped. So that's the story.
It takes a lot of guts to make that happen.
Well, it's part of the dangers of working in development. If you really are interested in working in development, you have to be in the field. And there are risks that you must take. And one doesn't anticipate all risks. You plan for most of them, but you mitigate for those when they arise. But you cannot mitigate for the risks of violent transfer of power, which is essentially what we were living through.
Okay. So I'm just going to ask one more question, and that is of course on the main topic, and then we'll throw it open to all of you who want to talk to Anita and get inputs. That's why we said more like a fireside chat and not like a seminar or a speech. And that is about obviously the state of gender equality worldwide, because Anita comes from a very macro viewpoint. Till I met Anita, I was very proud of the fact that I've traveled to 87 countries. But you meet somebody from the World Bank and UN, number of countries that she has been to is clearly 3 digits, so have this big inferiority complex. So the little I know about women in India, of course, the jury is still out. I'm sure if I take a poll amongst you, you would say 50% of you would say that women are now getting much better recognition. 50% will still say that these beastly men, they don't know how to treat women. I presume. We can talk about it as we go along. But if you take a country like Japan, for instance. I mean, in my multiple trips to Japan, I was always horrified. It was so much of a men's club. And I remember having long discussions in the boardroom in Fujitsu. The only woman we saw was a woman coming to serve tea. Whereas you go to China, for instance, China is full of women in leadership positions. Not anymore, not at this point. You see that happening. Middle East, of course, impossible. I remember my very good friend who was working with me in Zensa, Pramila. She was like, very bold. She would never say no to an opportunity. And once we were doing a project in Saudi Arabia, Pramila said, I'll go and manage the project. So clearly she was denied a visa, and they said, look, the only women who get visas to Saudi Arabia, and I'm talking about 15 years ago, it's changed quite a lot now, are either Filipino maids, because Filipino maids are indispensable, or a different category which we will not name here. But otherwise you have to be married to the guy you travel. So we've seen all these dimensions. So what is your view on what's been the progress in gender equality worldwide, Anita, from your vantage position in development? And then talk about India, what you see on your trips and what you perceive. It may not be 100% accurate, but what's your perception?
Yeah. No, thank you. I think, look, from a global perspective, the picture is a bit mixed and schizophrenic actually. There are some areas where you look at the data, like maternal mortality rates for women have improved hugely. Social indicators for women have improved hugely. Access to education for girls has improved hugely. Now we're talking basically pre-pandemic, and I'll come to what happened during the pandemic. So there are indicators of, particularly in the social sector and economic opportunity, where there are improvements. But it all depends on what is the baseline. And frankly, the baselines were very low. And so even though in relative terms there has been quite a lot of progress, in absolute terms, the condition of gender equality in the world today is very fraught. And it's fraught because the pandemic had very severe consequences for women in most parts of the world. And it really affected 3 things for women. One was income, the second is security, and the third was health. Income, because most of the sectors that were affected in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic were sectors which had heavy representation of women in the labor force. And so, a lot of women lost jobs. And what we have seen post-pandemic is that female labor force participation is now highly variable across countries, and in many countries it has dropped a lot. Actually, this is a very worrying trend in India. I cannot get hold of the right numbers. People tell me that the rate has dropped from 23% to now 19%, and now 16% are the latest numbers that I have seen. And the jury is out on what is actually causing this decline in labor force participation. participation. So that is one very worrying trend when you look at what is women's access to economic opportunity. They are not re-entering the labor force. The second issue that I talked about was security. And here we have to talk about the fact that violence against women, which the Secretary General appropriately called the shadow pandemic during the pandemic, became obvious during the pandemic. So if there's a silver lining about the pandemic, one of the silver linings is that something that had previously been in the realm of individual household policy, something that was supposed to be dealt with at the nuclear family level, became an issue of public policy because it was so visible. You couldn't get away from the fact that the phones were ringing off the hook for women's rights organizations and civil society organizations across the world, from women who were being beaten and abused by typically their partners at home. And because people could not go out and there was forced lack of mobility, it created the perfect conditions for abuse. And so much so that in France, the government had to rent 20,000 rooms for women who were victims of violence. In some countries in Europe, they had to come up with these symbols and signals that women could use if they were going to the pharmacy to say, help me, because they couldn't use their phones at home. And the reason I'm talking so much about this, because to me it is astonishing, and this is something that we are lobbying for, that violence against women has not yet been declared an epidemic and a public health issue, because it actually constrains a woman's ability to be fully healthy. And it is, quite apart from the fact that it's a human rights violation, violence against women, was discussed in Australia by somebody like Scott Morrison, who, when he was Prime Minister, was not somebody who was known as a feminist. But he had to take to television and say, we have a problem with violence against women in this country. And, because he was being given data by his cabinet that on Google, the biggest searches for some time in Australia were on how do I get help for violence against women. So I think very passionately about this. I'm on the Lancet Global Commission on Gender-Based Violence. And, we are trying everything we can through UN Women and multilateral fora to get more attention to violence against women, because it has not been dealt with as an economic issue. Now that the IMF has a gender strategy, we have asked the IMF to do more empirical work on the link between violence against women and growth rates, because not enough has been done on that. Some work has been done on child marriage, which is another form of violence against women. So when I talk about security being the other issue that we saw really come to the fore in the aftermath of the pandemic, it's not just the intimate partner violence, it is also the huge rise in child marriage that we saw during the pandemic. You alluded to this, Ganesh. We saw it in India, we saw it in Africa, and it was partly because of economic drivers. People, in some parts of the world, people were getting kids married off because they didn't have to throw a big celebration during the pandemic. And in some parts of the world, they were doing it because they couldn't feed the girls. But overall, the impact of the pandemic on girls has been absolutely devastating. UNICEF calculates that there are now 11 million girls out of school. 11 million more girls out of school after the pandemic. So that is huge, and that's not something you recover from in a year. There were countries in the world, Peru, Philippines, where girls have been out of school for 2 years. So you can't come back if you were in grade 6 and suddenly be put into grade 8. And this lack of thinking on the part of governments about how to really get kids, particularly girls, back into school will have long-term consequences for society, because you're not investing in the human capital of half of your population. So, security. Then health. Well, governments had to appropriately pivot to deal with the pandemic. So naturally, spending on maternal mortality issues, on nutrition inputs for girls dropped, and particularly for sexual and reproductive health, right, which is foundational for women's rights, dropped. And you cannot tell a woman who needs an abortion, please come back in 6 months. And so, this has been also a big impact of the pandemic. But I want to layer all of this with 2 other things that are happening in the world. And that is, whether it is social media, which is to blame, or the rise of what illiberal democracy in many parts of the world, the fact is that there is now a different mindset around women's rights in many parts of the world. So those of us who are on the front lines of this really see in the intergovernmental processes at the UN, which are long and can take many days, and you negotiate statements and you negotiate resolutions, but they are quite, they're fairly convoluted processes, but they are very good indicators of where is a government standing on a particular issue. And I will tell you that it feels like we are re-litigating things that we have already litigated. Because suddenly, a remarkable number of countries do not want to agree to any language in any document on sexual and reproductive rights for women. So you have countries in Europe who are European when it comes to the war, but not at all European when it comes to the issue of sexual and reproductive rights. So we're having discussions in New York which will seem very alien in India, because nobody in India really gets worked up about abortion other than when there's a question of the girl child versus the boy child and getting rid of female fetuses. But other than that, nobody here, you don't really question a woman's right to have an abortion. Believe me, when you live in New York, you have to pinch yourself when you read what's happening in the US and say, wait, are we really discussing that a woman cannot have an abortion even if she is a victim of rape? I mean, where are we living? Is this the 21st century, or are we in medieval Europe? And when you read that Supreme Court opinion that changed everything for women in the US, which I read, from the very first word to the very last word, just to understand what was the thinking of these judges, it is astonishing, because these judges are quoting 17th century texts to make the case for why a woman cannot have a right to abortion in 2023. So this is in the US. And this is happening in many countries in Europe. And the way it is happening, Ganesh, is they call this family law. Family law. We must protect families. So protection of families has become a euphemism for women need to go back to the kitchen, women need not to have abortion rights, women need to have babies. Now, the other thing that is happening is because the demographic bulge is really seen in India and in Africa and parts of Asia, right? Young populations. But in many other parts of the world, you have declining populations. You have a declining fertility rate because women want to go to work. Look at Japan, right? So what has happened in Korea, you have had the Korean population has elected a president who ran on a platform which said, too many women are working, not enough women are having babies, and instead of thinking about immigration and labor, and immigration as a way to solve for the declining fertility rate, it is easy to blame women. Why are they working so much? Why aren't they having babies? Why do they want to have jobs? So, for me in my role, which is representational, and I spend a lot of time talking to governments, ministers, prime ministers, it is absolutely astonishing every time we have to have a conversation about something where you think, why am I having this conversation in 2023? Why are we spending our time more productively on how do you create acceleration for women's economic agency? How do you leapfrog? What about digitalization? How do you unity? So I think the issue of social norms, cultural attitudes, and stereotypes is a big issue for us to tackle, because social norms are now changing in a way where you are hardwiring into some societies the most negative antediluvian images and ideas about women. And that is really dangerous, because these are countries who have elected freely and democratically, so something is going very wrong. We at UN Women do a global survey every year with a large PR firm called Kantar. The last global survey showed that for young men between the ages of 18 and 24, they really don't like seeing women in leadership positions. So there is a whole area that needs more work, which is how do you make men allies in the battle for gender equality? Because gender equality is not a women's issue only. It is a whole of society issue, because when women have more agency, their families prosper, their communities prosper, their economies prosper. I've spent a lot of time talking to development finance institutions, because that's the world I come from, saying, you guys are not doing enough, and you guys need to do more, not just to spend more on gender equality projects as the World Bank or EBRD or the IMF or whatever. In the IMF, we have asked that gender be considered part of Article 4 consultations, and that if you really believe gender is macro-critical, well then every time you go to a country IMF, how about you ask them, what are you doing? Are you doing gender-based budgeting? What are you spending on gender? Tell us the indicators that show that women are doing better in your society. Last point I want to make is on representation, leadership. Because it's very easy to get fooled. You can look at India and say, oh gosh, so many women CEOs now. Gosh, all the banks used to be run by women in India. There's no problem of access. But it's actually not true. Because when you look a little harder at the numbers, you will still see on most boards they don't have enough women. And most CEOs are not women. And even though you may have parity at recruitment when people first enter the labor force, maybe 50-50, there is a big funneling effect. And by the time you get to the top, the women have all dropped off. Where have they gone? They have gone because they have care burdens. So women, as long as the care burden of women is not shared by men, gender equality isn't going to change. Because women do 3 times as much unpaid care work as men. That shot up during the pandemic. And now, I'm happy to say, countries recognize this again as no longer a family issue, but a public policy issue. So Argentina, Uruguay, Mexico, and now Spain, I just met with the Spanish minister, are all legislating about the care economy, laying out expectations of both the public sector and the private sector to provide enabling environments for women to go back to work. That's happening. And then perhaps one very last point on values. It's become easy to say we need more women at decision-making tables. I would be the first to say we need to see more representation of women, we need to see more women in power, we need to see more women where the decisions are made. Why in 2023 are we still congratulating a woman for becoming the first CEO on Wall Street, right? Why in 2023 are we saying, oh my God, the first commissioner of the European Union is a woman? Well, we should be able to take this for granted today. And it is important it is really important to have more women in power, but it is also important to have the right kind of men in power who support women, and the women with the right feminist values. Because look, we got a woman on the Supreme Court of the US, and look what happened. So you've got a woman as the president of Italy, the prime minister of Italy today, who is not really in favor of women's rights. And so, you have, in the way that we might think about them, right? And Chatham House rules here. I hope this video is not being shown anywhere else. Can I have your assurance on this?
Yes.
Thank you. But, you have women in power
You're
today.
speaking the truth anyway.
No, I know, but, we have to. Anyway, you know what I mean. But what I'm saying is that you have women today in positions of power who are not friends forever. So it is not just about having women who are in positions of power, it is about having women and men who are feminists.
That's awesome. Comments, questions to Anita, and of course we will have to give a good man the right to ask the first question, Dr. Anita.
I'll have to borrow your mic.
Yes, please do.
Yeah, we need to probably use a mic for the simple reason that we are recording.
Akash, do you have another mic?
Yes.
Okay, until he gets it. So, I'm going to call you Anita, if you don't mind. So,
Please.
fantastic and really very, very wonderful. And on behalf of everybody, I want to invite you. So, this is going to be too short a talk at Berkeley Institute. I would invite you to come and spend a couple of days here and give a full, maybe 2-module lecture or even better. So, so that more people get to talk to you and get your insights. So wonderful. I'm going to ask you 2 questions, and you can please keep your answers brief because I don't know how all the time. So, the first question, they're very specific questions. So, India passed a law in 2016 recognizing the fact that you need to protect and promote women's employment. So, we passed a law, national law, saying that, so both these questions are related to law but also economic implications. The law says that if a woman is employed and wants to take maternity leave, you have to compulsorily give 26 weeks maternity leave. That's the law. Okay. And this was to protect women's employment and to enable them to go on maternity leave. Now what happened in fact was a few years later when they found out women's employment actually went down by about 2 million. Because now the employers are thinking, yeah, why should I take this judgment? So just basically the reaction to this law has been counter to what the intent of the law was. So my first question to you is, how would you devise a law like this and how would you enforce or how would you ensure that in fact it meets what it's intended to meet, namely to promote women's employment? These are exactly the opposite effect. My second question is a little more provocative, so you may choose not to answer it. In Indian law, since you're a lawyer, I know that, there are only 4 instances in the law. The principle of law is you're innocent until proven guilty. This principle is overturned only in 4 cases. One is for narcotics. If 10 grams of narcotics are found on your body, you're presumed to be guilty. The second is Dalit atrocity. If you do say anything which is casteist, you're presumed to be guilty. The third and fourth relate to dowry death, and the fourth is rape, accusation of rape. So now it seems on the third one, dowry, again it's a gender issue. There is this law has been around. The inversion of principle of innocence has been around for many years. I think at least 10 or 15 years. There is a now undercurrent and sort of growing field that this is being misused. In fact, there is a movie. I don't know if anybody's seen this Article 375. There's a movie on this now, a regular Bollywood movie. So, what is your reaction to that? Of course, I completely sympathize with what you said about Roe versus Wade overturning after 50 years. But here's an example of a law which is supposed to empower women, but actually this also is having a kind of a bizarre effect.
Okay, so on the first question, look, I think there has to be accountability, and so if employers are not hiring because they don't want to deal with the jhanjat of women who choose to take maternity leave, then I think they have to be held accountable. There should be some mechanism to monitor and track this.
You can't penalize for not hiring.
No, but
in anticipation of that, people are just choosing not to hire women.
yeah, but then I think we need more conversations with role models and leaders to explain and to role model the right behaviors. And again, I think there has to be more work done in all research institutes about the economic case for hiring women. Because that's a very short-term attitude. Okay, you don't hire this woman for 20 because you don't want to deal with the hassle of 26 weeks. But what about the long-term prospects and the long-term productivity gains that you will get? So, there needs to be more empirical research to make the business case and to get a bit of a tipping point on this. We're nowhere near the tipping point at all, and we don't have enough role models. You don't have enough men speaking up about the need to go against the grain. I mean, imagine if FICCI or all the leaders in FICCI, right, came out and said, you know what, this is really costly to us in the short term, but in the medium term we recognize this, so we are going to hire women like this. And IX have just done this, right? I was talking to a large multinational CEO and he was saying, I was asking him, do you have equal paternity leave for men like you do for women? And he said, we do, but my problem is none of the men take it. I said, did you? Simple question. And he said, did you? And he stopped in his tracks and said, no. I said, well then how do you expect the people who work for you to do it? You have to role model the behavior you want to see. And it's a long process, it's not going to happen overnight. And this issue of how much do you legislate? Because there are lots of people who will tell you, I don't believe in quotas, women are good, we'll hire them anyway, right? Well, look how long it's taken to get women on boards without quotas. So it also depends on how much of a sense of urgency do you have around this issue and how much do you want to drive it. If I'm convinced today, in general, I would come from a mindset which would say, you know, you don't need special measures. The market should work, talent will rise to the top. Broadly, that is my thinking. But on these issues, I have come to the conclusion that if you do not have temporary special measures, it's just going to take too long. Look at the newest data from UN Women. It shows that if we continue at this rate of progress, you know, you look at UN Women data, you look at World Economic Forum data, you are talking over a century. In some cases, some estimates say 3 centuries to reach gender equality. However you measure it, parity in leadership, parity in parliaments, you know, without special measures, I can tell you that the number of parliamentarians that you have who are women today worldwide, who make decisions that affect your bodies and mine and all sorts of other things, will never be enough. Today, 25% of parliamentarians worldwide are women. Why is it only 25 when populations in most countries are 50%? You will not convince me that you do not have talented women who cannot become parliamentarians. So there's
9%.
no, it's very low. It's very low. So you know, so I think this issue is something that you do need to legislate around. The second question on you know, the perverse impacts of a law that was meant to actually incentivize things, that's a little tougher to answer, I think, because I can see why this was done, but
To protect gender, you're okay with involving the principles of law? That's the question.
I mean, that's what I said. It's a harder question to answer because in general, again, I would come from a mindset and my legal training is such that I would have said, no, this principle is inviolate and it holds for all circumstances. And frankly, during the Me Too movement, there was a lot of questioning of, you know, some of the accusations that women were making. But it is also true that women tend to be doubted when they bring accusations forward and they are not given benefit of the doubt. So this is why some jurist in, you know, his or her wisdom decided about this. But I'll have to think about that a little bit more.
Questions? Yep, yes.
And thank you for the very inspirational background and Ganesh for the introduction. I wanted to know, has UN Women done any work or collaborated with other multilateral organizations on how to measure the unpaid work done by parents or homemakers at home? So one problem I have researched and read about extensively is women do the work, there is no accounting for it, so they're called you know, not working as far as the formal labor force is concerned. But there's another side to it. If you don't convince someone that something is remunerative in nature,
Yes.
the sharing of the burden may not happen as quickly as one intends or as quickly as the economy might benefit from it. So how do we address that? And secondly, we've also seen in a country like India, more women in the rural areas tend not to drop out because they have no choice.
Right.
They must work
Yes.
for whatever pay they get, whether it's at parity or not, they must work. Another flip side to that is the fact that there are often very neglected, undernourished, malnourished children who just don't get the benefit of a parent's attention and time and education to raise them as productively as they might have been otherwise. So I wanted to understand, has there been thinking or work done around this?
There has been some. I think, again, it's a question that many feminist economists have tried to deal with. They come at it from a particular angle which doesn't always sit well with the mainstream and which is why I think it hasn't been picked up as much. UN Women itself did a report called the Progress Report on the Care Burden many years before it became fashionable to talk about it, because actually the pandemic made it possible to talk about the care burden in a way that just wasn't there. It wasn't visible. It wasn't a public policy issue before, right? So UN Women has a report. I encourage you to go look at it. It's a few years old. It was written by a woman who's now at ILO, and she's a good researcher, so I think it would have, I don't know if it has the actual accounting, that you're talking about. But look, I think for this issue, and this is something I will be discussing with India's Gender Minister, is I think we need to start thinking about how do you legislate and how do you get the private sector and corporates, who are the largest employers, typically and largest contributors to GDP, to step up and start taking on the care burden, because this cannot be done at the individual family level alone. No way.
Other questions? Yeah, question.
You spoke about how social norms are shifting towards, for the worse
In some countries.
in some countries. Great. So I actually wanted to sort of get a sense of where is the hope here. Are there any examples that you come across of where the norms have shifted? There are a lot of examples of incremental gains, but where actually a country or a community, or however one defines a community, has succeeded in shifting norms for the better.
Look, I actually think in India norms have shifted in a good way for women in many ways, okay? Because you are now seeing an increasing acceptance of women being able to work in fairly traditional families. I mean, I come from Calcutta, which has a lot of, which is a very large Marwari community. And when I go back and I look at my Marwari friends who were in school with me and who were married off right, when they were in high school or just after high school, there is no way they will allow their daughters to do that. These young women are all either studying in the US, becoming accountants, doing things that would have been unthinkable for their mother's generation. And so I do see a norm shift for the better in many ways in many parts of India. I think norms around the roles of women and the multiple roles of women still remain very strong, particularly in rural India. But I think in the big cities, in tier 1, tier 2, even tier 3 cities, norms have shifted quite a bit here. Other places where norms have shifted, I find, is in the Arab states and in the Arab region. In the Arab region, this is not well known. Again, the much larger percentage of people studying STEM subjects, which were considered historically male subjects, are actually women. STEM graduates tend to be predominantly women in the Arab states, not men. And so norms have shifted there too, because it's now okay for women to be programmers, coders, in the tech industry. Where there is reversal, as I said, is in some very surprising places, in parts of Europe that you wouldn't think, in parts of the US, where this has been building for decades, obviously, and these changes don't happen overnight. So it's a very mixed picture, but in general, being a student of history, you think of progress as forward, and so it's very hard to see that you have to relitigate things that you had already litigated. So I feel in gender equality, we are always running to stay in place. We're running, but we're not actually getting anywhere in many things. So that's the metaphor that I like to use.
Yes, ma'am.
You have mentioned abortion, which actually brings us to the elephant, and I call it a big elephant in the room, which is religion. Because abortion in US is very much related to religion.
Yes.
And one conjecture which I could make, which you may agree or you may not agree, is that in India, since 80-85% of the people are Hindus and many others are affected by Hinduism, abortion never became an important issue because Hindus believe that we are born again and again, while the Islam or Christianity believe that you have only one life. So you can't murder anyone and you can't kill yourself also. So suicide is also wrong according to religion. You can't murder. So that's the reason you can't even kill a fetus. I was just wondering how will the multilateral international agencies like the World Bank and UN really deal with the issue like religion? Because it's really not very easy because religion is very much there in all these things which are happening. That's the first thing which I wanted to ask you.
Mm-hmm.
And the second is, there has been a lot of talk about Indian women, workforce falling. But I think some more work needs to be done before we really say that it's a trend which is not really so good. Because have we really asked the women whether they want to work or not? Because typically what you see is that it is the woman at the lower end and women at the higher end. at the lower end because they have no option, like she just said, they have to work. And I mean, who is talking about leave for 24 weeks when you have had a child, when only 8% are working in the organized sector, and out of which I don't know, maybe 1.5% are women.
Right.
You know, most of the women just start working.
Yes.
When they have to start working. So, because, and at the higher end, because you can always keep help,
Yes.
domestic help and things like that.
Yes.
So, if the incomes are rising, then maybe I feel from the anecdotal experience that women don't really mind not working, because working in any case is not bringing any freedom to them. There is no economic freedom, there is no other freedom. So I feel that, maybe we need to look at all these angles instead of just making an issue about women in India are working less. So let us look at it in some, sociological aspects also and find out what the women really want to do.
I think that's a really important insight, and actually I've been talking to employers, large employers, who have been telling me that many times the women actually are choosing to not work not because the income would be nice, but they have a preference, and this is now being seen even in higher income classes where they have a preference for not working. And so I don't know how you get at that issue. That is a norms issue, but I do think labor force participation in India is not well understood and needs more research and needs more disaggregation between rural and urban. The other thing is that, I think coming to your point, first religion, what a great point. I mean, religion really matters, and faith-based organizations are organizations we work with because they are so influential in their communities. One of the few ways we have been able to achieve progress on this horror called female genital mutilation in Africa is because we have worked with tribal leaders and faith-based organizations, but also the mothers who are the perpetrators of this crime against their own daughters, right? And there, again, you have to go to this issue of cultural beliefs and cultural beliefs in people. So gender equality is a wicked problem that requires interventions at a very early stage in families if you want things to be different. Because talking about religion, there was a survey done of pastors in, I believe it was Uganda, I'm trying to remember which country I was in. And most pastors in this country, it was in East Africa, I do remember that, believed that it was perfectly okay for men to beat their wives. And this is a very deeply held cultural belief because it shows love for the wife, and the women who were interviewed in this survey also thought it was okay for the women to be beaten because it was an expression of the fact that, maybe she hadn't cooked well or something. So how do you change that? You have to change that in the family unit very early on, which means educational curricula have to change, which means role models have to change, which means celebrities have to talk about this, which is why UN Women works a lot with sports celebrities and other celebrities to say, we need you out there as champions. We need you out there talking about these difficult issues and saying, talking about the unmentionable basically, if we want to change these norms and attitudes. And I was very happy the World Bank is revising its gender strategy. I'm sorry it took so long, but finally the World Bank has recognized that their gender strategy must focus on social norms. So now the big part of the revision of the gender strategy is no longer just about economic empowerment, which is how people think about gender equality. It's like, does the woman have agency? Does she have economic opportunity? But gender equality is about a lot more, and it is first and fundamentally about social norms, cultural attitudes.
Let's say religion. Let's not shy away from using
No,
this
I
word
agree.
because-
I agree. It's just a very difficult thing to put on the table because you do have to engage, and religious beliefs do dominate conversations about abortion.
Which may be a problem in the US as well. I mean, I completely agree with you, ma'am. I spent the better part of last week in Manila and talking to this young friend, Daryl, who was taking me around the city, and just generally talking about women's rights. He says, yes, we're still trying for the right for women to abort. And when I said, really, not that yet? He said, no, a woman can't even divorce her husband because Catholic law does not permit this, and they're 97% Catholic.
Yes,
So that probably affects a lot of the thinking in Protestant America as well.
it does.
So it's a very complex issue as what you're raising. So, any other questions? Jai Hu hai. Thank you. Sure.
My question relates to violence against women that you have spoken about earlier. I was reading several reports on this earlier, and I found that there are a lot of unorganized sectors in handicrafts, villages, and in the cottage industry sectors, which offer a sort of a refuge for women who go through violence on a daily basis. They come there in the afternoons to sit and sew or embroider with their sisters, and it provides them sort of relief. But what we have been seeing that in India as well as other parts of developing nations, cottage industries and handicrafts industries are almost as good as dying, and thereby a place to address these issues for women also are in very many ways getting affected and drying up. I know you've talked about systemic failures within structures and within governments that is not able to handle violence against women. Is there some thought or is there some thinking about these unorganized sectors where women are employed in very heavy numbers, which also offer them a sort of a refuge from the troubles that they're going through on a daily basis, and in helping women to just navigate day-to-day life?
Yeah, I mean, most countries that have programs to end or reduce violence against women, first they focus on prevention and about training on prevention, and most of them will have shelters and places for women to go to gather and organize. It is true that informal organizing around cottage industries provides a respite for a lot of women, and it is a place of refuge. But typically those centers where they are doing their artisanal work are not the same centers as safe spaces for women. In this country, a lot of centers have been set up which are one-stop shops for victims who are women who are victims of violence against women. So I would say in most countries there is a recognition that there is a need for these spaces. I have not seen much work that looks at just the issue of how do you connect just the unorganized labor in cottage and informal industries to the issue of shelters for violence against women. What I can say is the latter system generally exists. Of course, in countries like Afghanistan now, that whole system has disappeared, and of the 14 shelters that we used to, as women, support, there's one that's now still working, and that will probably go to. So, when I think about violence against women, you have to think about places also like Iran and Afghanistan, where there is a gender apartheid in progress. So,
you've answered part of my questions in the last 5 minutes. I've had the privilege of being connected to families who have employed a lot of people. So the verbal drill is, we will support girls, we will support women, but in action they're not doing it. How do you make them see sense?
So, can you say a little bit more about the context?
When you say families, can you explain what you mean?
So when you have to talk to people, you end up saying, yes, we must give the girl child a chance, give her the same opportunities, things like that. But when it comes to actually executing it, when you're employing women in, say, in your organization, you're not walking the talk really. How do you put it into that? And the other thing I've seen is, somebody mentioned in the lower strata and the highest strata. The highest strata has helped that kind. In the highest strata, I look more and more closely and I see the oldest woman in the family actually being the most difficult to overcome.
Yes, that is true.
They're not friends. They're not friends with the younger.
No, it's true. it is true that there is a stereotype about, the matriarch in the family who sets the norms of the family and who sets the informal rules by how that family operates, and those rules are often extremely discriminatory and disrespectful of the younger women in the family, do not recognize their rightful place. But that goes to, and there's a reason for that stereotype, right, of the sas, for instance, and those stereotypes get perpetuated generation after generation because there isn't enough work in our society, in our country, to attack these cultural norms, and because there are not enough men pushing back against it. This is why I keep coming back to the role of men in gender equality, because I think one of the learnings of the last few decades of work on women's rights and gender equality has got to be the recognition of where power sits. And once you recognize that this is really about power and distribution of power, you look at who really holds the power, it is still men in many things. And therefore, if they do not say to their mother or to the wife, this behavior is wrong and you should not be doing it, then that behavior is going to continue. So, the role of men is, I think, one of the underutilized assets in the fight for gender equality. And I think that much more research, attention, programming, design needs to be around that. There's no way we are going to win this battle for women just with the women fighting it.
So actually my question was connected to what we're discussing right now. We've done a lot of policies and laws around labor participation or dowries or abortion, etc. But what are we doing at micro level? Like how are we really educating our men to be conscious about women's rights? How are we conditioning the families? How are we breaking the social norms which are actually against gender equality? So that is one point. And secondly, are we doing something to dilute the judgments that are passed against women? A woman can choose to be at home. Respect that. Acknowledge that. She can be an unpaid worker at home. By call her unpaid worker, she's contributing to the family. We are not talking around these things. We are talking about her participation at workforce, her being on boards of companies. But these are also underlying issues with where the morale or the being of the woman herself goes down. So what are we doing around these issues?
On the social norm change, there are countries where norms have changed dramatically. But it has taken sustained campaigns and some, groups of civil society and rights organizations to change that. I'll give you one example. Ireland, deeply Catholic country, highly opposed to, historically opposed to gay rights. How did it change? It changed because there was a concerted campaign for years where campaigners would go to, families and knock on the doors and say, do you know somebody who's gay in your family? Now, how would you like it? And nearly everybody knew, even if it wasn't in their family, they knew somebody. So they could empathize and relate. And they'd say, well, do you think that their rights should be like this? People typically think and say, no, they should have the same rights. They say, well, then will you agree with this legislation? And that's how, after years and decades of work, Ireland was able to get to a place where today you have in government people who can be expressing their full human rights, can have a different sexuality, and where the country now has laws that respect LGBTQI rights. This was unthinkable, many decades ago. So it requires sustained effort. So, the women's groups in India have to launch this campaign for change of social norms. This is why I say, I think the role of men and the role of social norms are two of the things that we should be working on heavily, changing norms, changing attitudes, intervening at the family level, building role models, enlisting celebrities, creating champions, changing educational curricula. When I went to high school when I went to school in this country, I never had to read anything about gender equality. I never studied anything about, why it is good, why it is bad. You know, everything was picked up by osmosis from the environment, not from formal pedagogy. So formal pedagogy has to include, you know, every kid should be taught, as they're taught the alphabet, women's rights. And so let's start teaching it, you know. The education policy has to include that. So all of these, look, there's no one intervention. There's no single silver bullet. There are multiple interventions over long periods of time that are going to change things.
We had a question.
Hi. Although women always working, either it is unpaid, it is invisible or underpaid, or we can say. But for modern society like Pune, Gurgaon, Bangalore, Hyderabad, women also facing the regulatory framework in the private companies in KPOs, IT sector, like working hours, location wise. Like one woman is working in Kharad in Pune, which is and his home in Hinjawadi. So he used to travel 2 to 3 hours on daily basis. So can we change the regulatory framework in private sectors? So for location wise working hours, or we can say we redesign the regulatory for women so they can work easily.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point because I think gender intentionality is very key in design of public policy. So how do you bring gender intentionality, and how do you say, okay, we're a rich private company, which I'm looking at you, so you should have buses that provide safe transport for women, for example, right? You should allow flexible work. You should, you know, all of these things. You know, it's amazing when you start adopting a gender lens to any area of public policy, how things change. I'll give you a simple example. Hurricane. You know, I'm trying to remember which country it was. There was a hurricane. All the humanitarian actors came in and, you know, food. No, I'll give you another example. I was at a refugee camp on the border of Uganda and South Sudan. So I meet all these Sudanese refugees who are exhausted because they have gotten to the camp and they are mentally and physically depleted because they got to the camp after walking for days, and the price of getting to the camp was agreeing to be raped many times. Right? You have to agree to be raped. So these women had all agreed because they are children and they wanted to get to the camp. So they come to the camp and they are just broken people. And I was there to give one of these women a leadership award because she had just been elected to a local council. So I said to her, how has this changed your life and the lives of the people here? And she said, you know, nobody was thinking about the needs of women till I came on the council, and all the humanitarian actors who were bringing food for us brought it in packets that were too heavy for us to carry. And guess who's carrying the packets of the food back to the home? It's the women, it's not the men. So she said, my first job as the council leader was to say to the humanitarian agencies, please halve the size of the bag because it's too heavy for us to carry. Small thing, but it makes you realize that when you have a gender lens, how it changed. She said, now my back doesn't hurt. And then she said, the second thing I did was, because we still get assaulted, even in the camp, people want to rape us. You know, she said, what I asked them for, now that I'm on the council, I said, please put street lights at night so that the women don't get attacked. Again, you bring a gender lens to a simple policy like how should you do electricity in this camp. You immediately think of something that no man thinks of because they're never in that position. So, you know, this gender lens in policy is very important because it will give you insights that you would not have had otherwise.
But actually your point, that is a big point. I remember, and exactly what Anita said, sometimes men decide policies in their superior wisdom on what they think women need. The company I ran for 15 years in Pune, Zensar and Kharadi, where Shamini was very much part of our team. So our whole premise was that we formed a Women for Excellence group, which was only women. They used to recommend the policies and they used to vet any new policy created. Because otherwise we have this, almost like male superiority attitude saying we will be condescending and nice towards women and do all the wrong things. So I think it's extremely important for women to articulate what they need. Because otherwise you do the wrong thing. I mean, you're talking about people being dropped back. I still remember when we first had this issue, when there was a case of a rape or a near rape in Bangalore. Okay, when Som Mittal, who was president of NASCOM at that time, was in his company, digital. And the whole approach started. And the minute you leave it to government, I mean, we had this thing, the government said, we always said women should not work in night shifts. So imagine, and easily could have been implemented. We asked the women said, who said we don't want to work in night shifts? My friend who's an air hostess in this airline is working. Why not? Make it safer. So under the policies that we design, that a woman will never be the last person to be dropped. That if two men are the women, we will send another woman along with them. And every company in the industry had to implement those policies. So it's important. I mean, I love the word intentionality. We didn't use it then, but I think if it is with a sense of intentionality, you'll find it much better. But I don't think men have any right to preach to women what they should be doing. On the other hand, we should be very open to listening and then implementing what makes sense.
Sometimes, Ganesh, it's not even about intentionality. In the sense that, I was thinking of another example. There was a tsunami. I think this was, I'm trying to remember, Indonesia, Sri Lanka. So the humanitarian workers arrived, right? And they started building temporary shelters and all. And they built all this. And then the women and the families moved back and they said, but where are the kitchens? They forgot to put in, somehow they dabbed into the kitchens. They put in like bedrooms and bathrooms and everything. And then the women came and said, but where's the cooking going to happen? We're like, food delivery, right? They were thinking food packets will be delivered. But the women were like, yes, we get the food packets, but then somebody has to cook it. So they were like, so UN Women spends a lot of time actually with different kinds of actors, like humanitarian actors saying, are you thinking about gender? Because if you think about gender intentionally, then you get the street lights, you get the size of the package, you get the kitchen, and all these things that very well-meaning humanitarian actors have completely forgotten about. And even in the war in Ukraine, all the refugees who were fleeing, right? Packets were being distributed. Packets didn't necessarily have sanitary pads. And so it's like, okay, who put this packet together? It must have been a man, because they weren't thinking, oh my God, I should put a sanitary pad in here with the food, the eggs, the oil, the whatever, right? There should be a sanitary pad in here because these are mainly women and children who are fleeing. So you need that gender lens in public policy, private policy, and you have to mainstream it across all cabinets. That is why, when Minister Irani says, gender should be mainstream, I so truly believe that the only way this is going to happen is if every cabinet minister thinks about gender. And this is why UN Women pushes a lot for gender responsive budgeting, gender responsive infrastructure, gender responsive transport. Everything has to be gender responsive, otherwise you spend a lot of money and you don't get as much benefit as you could get had you done it with a gender intentionality.
Okay, what a fascinating conversation, and we'll bring it to a formal end, and of course Anita is here. But let me just close by saying one point, okay, which is that I remember, I think it was 1994, long time back. I was sitting in Mombasa. We were launching running a company called Aptec in those days. So we were launching an Aptec center, the first one in Kenya. And the Mombasa guy was just chatting with me and said, we were talking about how many women are employed in Kenya even in those days. And he said, let me tell you a story which will help you to understand the male psychology in this country. He said, look, there is a man in our village who was well known for beating his wife every night. Okay, and they set up the panchayat in India, they set up a community, so they are going to ask you, and in those days, this is an old story. He said they had something called the truth beam. So the only code was you swallowed the truth beam, and then they asked you the question, and you spoke the truth. So this man took the truth beam, and they asked him, are you guilty of beating your wife? He said, no. The truth beam didn't do anything, so it was fine, and they let him off. So later on, one of his friends asked him, how did you beat the truth beam? Because the truth beam always works. He said the question was, are you guilty of beating your wife? Yes, I beat my wife, but I don't feel guilty. So it's also sometimes a question that you ask the men where their mindset comes from. But exactly the point Anita made. If men and women both take joint responsibility for saying that women must feel comfortable in the workforce, in the family, in society, I think that we have it. But thank you, Anita. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation.
First of all, I would like to say that I'm happy to see that at least there is a sprinkling of some men and some boys.
Yes.
And I'm also happy that Ganesh, if I may, he's here, and it's not a talk between two women here. There's a man and a woman talking about it, because what happens usually on a 8th March function is that there are all women there, there are all women here, and I always call it something like a Haldi Kumkum. You know what is Haldi Kumkum? So only women are there. So I'm glad that it is not 100% Haldi Kumkum, but on a more serious note. But of course what I said was also serious. What we have is Anita has really made some very complex issues quite understandable. I'll not say she has simplified them. I'm sure you will have lots of ideas from whatever she has spoken. And when I was young, there was a book which I read, which was called Black Like Me. It was a part of my mother-in-law's book collection. I don't remember who had written it, but in that white person, it was written sometime late 60s. So in that book, a white man had converted himself into a black man temporarily by taking some injections and to do something with skin and all that. And he was like that for 6 months, and he moved around like that in the US, and after that he wrote that book. So what I always feel is that men should become women for at least 5 years of their life and have that kind of an experience, and also women should become women. Women should become like men for 5 years, so that they really have that kind of a swagger which you see in the men, and it will help the world if both of them are able to do something like that. Of course, the way you ended is something which I really like, which is that what we are seeing now is that the democracy itself is bringing in a lot of regressive changes, and it is not just with respect to women, but it is with respect to being anti-democratic also. So that is a serious note, and on which I would like to thank both of you, Anita, Ganesh. I do hope that we interact more in the future also. Thank you very much. Thank you to the audience.